Good morning. My name is Vince Minhares, and I'm a project manager with the Aspen Institute Sport and Society program. I lead our coaching and school sports portfolios. We're excited to be here. We've been having conversations about this for a really long time, and definitely since we've been back in Austin. Excited to share our panel with you and to talk about how youth sports can help solve the mental health crisis. Before I introduce our amazing group of youth sports leaders, I want to acknowledge the Million Coaches Challenge, which is what's brought us together. We're all partners in a commitment to train 1 million coaches in youth development, including mental health. This initiative exists through the amazing support of the Susan Crown Exchange, and we're really thankful for Kevin and Haviland and the work that they're doing in this space. Before I sort of set the scene for this conversation we are going to have, I do want to ask the audience, and you can do this by a round of applause because I can't actually see you through the lights, to get a sense for where you are in this space. So please, round of applause if you played sports as a young person. Round of applause if you still play sports today. Okay. Round of applause if you're coaching sports. Okay. And round of applause if you are sort of an administrator or work in a role that is involved in supporting youth sports. Okay. All right, we're okay. So let's sort of set this scene for today's conversation, and I'd like to do that by sort of giving a few contextual bits. First, 38 million kids play youth sports. It's a lot of kids. It's a lot of young people, and we see that as an amazing opportunity to support the health and well-being of young people today. To sort of think about what that means sort of in context, one, chance to move your body. Right? You got an opportunity to engage in moderate to vigorous physical activity. Two, physical and psychological safety, a chance to be around people who care about you and are going to look after you. Three, skill building, not just technical, tactical skills of the sport, personal, social, emotional, psychological skills. And four, connection, meaningful relationships with adults, with peers, and with other important people in your life outside of the home. That should not be taken for granted. Unfortunately, we operate in a space where it's not guaranteed just because you're in sport. And to be frank, you're not even guaranteed to play sport because access still remains a big issue for many millions of young people around the country. When we think about the work of delivering on this opportunity for youth sports, we have to start with the adults, in particular coaches. We are here because we really believe in the role of coaches in fostering these positive environments for young people. As an interesting sort of bit of data, for those of you data folks, researchers at Ohio State University, who are partners in this project as well, conducted a national survey. 10,000 coaches completed the survey, and you can find it. It's the National Coach Survey, wide swath of sports, context, youth, recreation, school. 10,000 coaches completed the survey, and the researchers asked them a number of really important questions about motivation, about training, about confidence. And, a couple things you would expect, what motivates coaches. Over 80% of coaches said that they were motivated by developing youth in their community, by their love of teaching the sport, which suggests that coaches are oriented towards that. When we ask them what their most confident behaviors are, things that you sort of would expect. Teaching skills, the technical skills of the game, fostering sportsmanship. But when you ask them what their least confident behaviors are, you start landing on things that feel very timely in the modern moment. You think about the lack of confidence in helping youth navigate social media, lack of confidence in referring young people to unmet needs, support for unmet needs, lack of confidence in being able to support performance anxiety, and very much a lack of confidence in understanding mental health supports. And so this creates a bit of a problem for us, right? Which is that coaches want to help young people. There's a lot of young people who want to play sport. There's a huge opportunity here. But are we actually positioning our coaches well to be able to deliver on this opportunity? And to their credit, the coaches in this survey also gave us an important piece. They said they want training. They said they wanted to have more support for, among other things, mental health, performance psychology, or performance anxiety, referring young people to resources in their community. It's a nice segue because now we get to ask our amazing team all about it. So I have the privilege and honor of introducing our three panelists, starting with Hannah Olson, who is the director of the University of Washington Leadership and Athletics Program, Megan Bartlett, who is the founder of the Center for Healing and Justice in Sport, and Doug Ute, who is the executive director of the Ohio State High School Athletic Association. We'll start with you, Hannah. Give the audience a little bit more background on the work that your program does, particularly the training that the commitment that you have and your interest and belief in youth sports, and why you think sports is important for mental health.
Sure. Thanks for having us today. Nice to see you all out there. Our center is founded on this idea that there's a really intense power in sport that can be harnessed for good, for youth development, for transformation of individuals, communities. And that power, kind of those outcomes that we seek, doesn't happen automatically, and we have to work hard to create intentional spaces if young people and groups are going to reap the benefits of what sport has to offer. And so our work centers on that space. We know that young people care deeply, like sport is a context that matters really, really deeply to a lot of young people. Perhaps more so than, what happens to them out on the field or the court is more important to them than what happens to them in their math classroom, for example. No disrespect to any math teachers that might be out there. But because it matters so much to them, what happens in that environment and what happens in that context is so crucial and is so important. And the messaging that they receive about themselves and their capabilities is huge in that space. And so we spend a lot of time in our office thinking about how we can prepare the leaders, the caring adults in the room, to create spaces where kids can thrive. And if they become good athletes along the way, great. But trying to gather some of those skills is really, really important. We work with a lot of school-based coaches as well, and there's a huge opportunity, particularly for school-based coaches, because they see athletes so frequently. And so you can get as we have conversations about wellness and mental health, coaches are really well suited to be able to check in with young people on a regular basis and see them every day at practice, understand what their baseline is, what they look like on an average day, and be able to know when something's going on, for better or for worse. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how to prepare coaches for that. Do you want us to go into specific training? We're waiting on that.
Next.
Great.
Megan?
Yeah, thanks. Hey, everybody. It's really nice to be here. As Vince said, I work on the team at the Center for Healing and Justice through Sport. And we are, our sharp point is figuring out how to give, similar to what Hannah said, how to give coaches the tools they need to be able to serve young people in the best way possible. We started this work because I think what we sometimes forget to name is that coaches are really undertrained as a general rule. Most coaches receive no training, and the training that they do receive is often not around sort of positive youth development, social and emotional learning, supporting positive mental health of athletes. And sometimes I'm, working with large systems like the Los Angeles Parks and Rec system, for example, and realizing that there are thousands and thousands of young people being served by an adult who has had maybe some training and maybe not. And that is, when you think about the context of most adults who work with young people and the training we expect, the behavior we expect, the sort of way that we expect them to be with young people, it's sort of shocking how little we sort of mandate from coaches. And so we're trying to change that dynamic. We're trying to upend the idea that coaches don't deserve to be invested in, and that so that we can really understand to Hannah's point, the real power they have to be a positive influence in young people's lives. And that doesn't just happen by accident. I think in sport, sometimes we think sport is inherently good. It is certainly not inherently good. There are plenty of people who've had bad experiences in sport and then end up not coming back, end up missing out on the opportunity to leverage that experience for good. So we're really focused on how do we help coaches do that? How do we help coaches create spaces where young people can be truly and authentically themselves and get the support they need in order to thrive? We have a little bit of a unique focus on neurobiology of human interactions, neurobiology of stress and trauma, and how coaches can leverage the sport experience to be a healing-centered experience for young people. And so I think that, that's deeply tied to how we support young people's mental health. Too many young people have experienced too many hard things in their lives, and so how do we make sport a place where we're intentionally creating something that does the opposite?
Thanks, Megan. Doug?
Wow, that's really good, both of you. We at the Ohio High School Athletic Association, we have nearly 70,000 coaches in Ohio, 350,000 athletes. We're the third largest state association in the country, behind California and Texas. Excuse me. And so think about this important fact that of those 70,000 coaches, nearly 70% of them are lay coaches, don't have a teaching background. Good folks, doctors, engineers, farmers, folks who pour concrete all day, that come in and coach our student athletes without any kind of training at all. And my background from school, I was a teacher, coach, athletic director, high school principal, and a 20-year superintendent in Ohio. And we're just so doggone happy that somebody wants to coach 8th grade track. We throw them the keys and we move on. And so there wasn't a whole lot of training for that. And so, and particularly coming out of COVID, which it doesn't matter what state you are, you're coming out of COVID where kids in Ohio were isolated for 2.5, 3 months from their peers. And, I was a superintendent at the time that we had to put up tape around our playgrounds to keep students off of our playgrounds. They weren't allowed on our properties and those kind of things. And so in June, when the governor opened that garage door, our students were coming back onto our campuses and with a lot of angst and a lot of issues that existed before COVID, but that was kind of a shot in the arm, so to speak, for the mental wellness piece of this. And so we're very fortunate in Ohio to team up with Life Sports at Ohio State University, which is a team of fantastic folks who do wonderful things to create Coach Beyond initiative for us. Coach Beyond the X's and O's, and with the good folks with Susan's group, and a few of them are sitting here in the front row, the support of that group, we've created a lot of training and really started with our member schools and our coaches and our administrators on what are they dealing with out there in our schools, and to create a program to help our coaches help their students. And what we found too is that, as we get into this, it's helping our coaches help each other, help themselves. That training that didn't exist, which we think will lead into the retention of our coaches, in a lot of sports. And so we're finding that as and our coaches found out really quick just what our teachers find out in our classroom. And I would mention this, the number one thing I dealt with the last 4 or 5 years I was a school superintendent was staff members saying, Mr. Ute, what am I supposed to do with this? And they would point at a child or something that way. And so, I'm one that believes that, coaching and teaching, coaching is an extension of the school day. And so again, with that doctor or lawyer or mom or dad who coach our kids need that support. And so, that's what we're really excited about our Coach Beyond initiative.
It's worth sort of reflecting for a moment about the impact of sport during COVID. and particularly for young people, there has been a lot of work that's come out of sort of post-COVID, experience, and we know that in some context, sport was the thing that held kids together. That it was a coach who was, creating an opportunity to stay connected, even if we couldn't come to training. Even if it was a Zoom call with the team, or it was, hey, stay on top of your academic schoolwork, or things of that nature. Sport can provide this sort of foundation for a set of life experiences, but again, it doesn't happen automatically. And I think it's worth transitioning now to sort of asking ourselves, what is it actually that we want coaches to be able to do and to be prepared to do? And there's different ways of thinking about that. As an example, the National Coach Survey, which I think is, again, an amazing resource, I would encourage you to look at it, ask coaches about certain communities who, how confident were you in your ability to support a specific community? And only 35% felt prepared to support, for example, eating disorders. Only 48% felt prepared to work with mental health outcomes. Only 57% with ADHD. Only 42% with trauma in the home environment. This is real stuff, right? So we really need, if we want to prop up coaching and sports in this way, we got to help the coaches. So we'll kind of walk back through again. Hannah, what does your training do? What are you specifically looking at in terms of what the center is doing? And maybe talk about the partnership with WIAA.
Yeah. So we are partnered with the state association in Washington, the WIAA, and we are trying to pass an amendment to their handbook, so kind of a policy angle, to require a baseline training and foundation for coaches across the state. So while that policy piece is happening and we're trying to work that through the system, we wanted to spend some time thinking about like what do coaches need specifically? And the field of coaching education is relatively new, and if you allow me to nerd out a little bit, as a good academic does, if you compare it to broader fields like sports science or psychology that has had really solid research taking place like throughout the 1900s, good coaching education research didn't really start till like 2010. So it's a baby, and we're still trying to learn what it is that coaches need, and I think that's an important piece of this. So we had like that nugget of what the research and the field tells us what we need, and what we really wanted to do was be responsive in Washington to what coaches were telling us that they were needing and what athletes were saying that we were needing. The athlete voice is missing so much and like so frequently when we create coaching education. And at the end of the day, like we're trying to create an experience for young people. So incorporating their voices is incredibly important. And we originally set out thinking that the plan was to create a social emotional learning course. And after talking to athletic directors and coaches and kids across the state, what we learned is that they really needed something even more foundational than that in terms of youth development principles. And we landed in this place of thinking about how can coaches create environments that are physically and emotionally safe for kids, and one that is grounded on relationships and connection. And what does that look like in a healthy sport environment? We may have time to talk about that a little bit, about what we do and don't tolerate in sports settings, which is problematic as a whole in this space, but our training is seeking to provide some really foundational nuggets for folks, almost along this line of like, first do no harm, because we do a lot of harm in sports with untrained coaches. And so giving coaches just these really baseline tools about how do you create a setting and a culture that a young person can walk in as themselves and be honored. And a second course that we're working on developing in tandem with it is, because it's for high school coaches, is around adolescent development. So what do we know about brains, bodies, and social characteristics of kids, and how do we center those needs and make them our top priority, and be responsive to them, and really push this angle of it's our responsibility as a coach to do that. It's not, shouting in the lawn like kids these days. Kids are kids, and they have specific needs, and it's our responsibility to be responsive to those. So that's our general approach, and we'll know here in about a month or so if the policy piece has passed. So light your candles, cross your fingers, whatever you do in your life to send good juju my way. I would appreciate that because we're really hoping that it can make a really nice impact for all the school-based folks across the state.
Amazing. Megan?
Yeah, Hannah did a great job summarizing we have a very aligned core philosophy about coaching, about the need for good coaches, about the need for what sport experiences should look like. And I would say what I think makes some of what we do unique is that we layer this piece of neuroscience on the top of it. And that is both because neuroscience helps us show the value of this, but also because, to Hannah's point, a lot of existing behaviors in youth sport are not great, and sometimes it's really hard for people to admit that they're not great. So we coach the way we were coached, just like we parent the way we were parented and teach the way we were taught. And if we don't see examples of the other thing, it's really easy for us to say, well, it worked for me, look how great I'm doing. Number one, are you doing that great? And number two, that worked for you, and you are one person coaching a group of people who are not one person, right? You are coaching a whole host of young people who have their own differentiated needs, and as a coach, it's our responsibility to be responsive to those individual needs. So this idea of one-size-fits-all coaching, or my way or the highway coaching, is really the harmful stuff that we're trying to undo. And so what we've found is that by talking to coaches about relationships through the lens of the brain, through the lens of neuroscience, makes it a little bit less soft, right? You tell a coach who has a certain way of doing things that to prioritize relationships, and they're like, yeah, I do that. And you look at their behavior and you're like, do you? Oh God, here comes that kumbaya lady again. And they think that asking them to do those things is actually taking away their ability to win or to meet the standards that they're held to in order to keep their job in some cases, or do whatever it is they see as part of their ultimate goals. And so we find that if we can frame what we do through the lens of what neuroscience tells us all humans need, then we're better able to get people to listen, get people to see this as both something that some things they are already doing and can add to, but also that this is real, important sort of scientific work that has real power, right? One of the things that I think coaches, because we don't invest in them because so many of them are not trained, they don't understand the potential power they can have. And when you really unpack that for a coach, when you really show them how what they do matters, it changes the sort of formula for how they show up. So we have a very similar approach or a philosophy to what Hannah described, and also try and help coaches feel empowered by the science that says what they're doing matters.
Thanks, Megan. Doug, talk about what's happening in Ohio. You guys are working with the live sports folks at Ohio State. What's the training situation there for coaches?
Yeah, sure. I love batting in that third spot here with these ladies, much what they said. So our Coach Beyond initiative was developed by interactions with our coaches and administrators and our student athletes in Ohio. And that's the beauty of it, is that through face-to-face or surveys and a little bit of research with our folks, we've been able to develop this and get out around Ohio physically get out around Ohio and do these trainings. And it's really powerful when these student athletes are saying, we have some school districts that might say from 3:30 to 4:30, our student athletes are going to be in this room with our coaches, along with our folks from our Coach Beyond group, leading some trainings and listening to students. And that's where it really grows, is just listening to students. But we're very fortunate in Ohio, and you won't find me as executive director or a former superintendent saying this very much. We're fortunate that we passed a bill to deal with this. A lot of times from our association, we don't like people in downtown Columbus getting in our business, writing laws that they don't really know about. But through our coaches who had communicated with some of our representatives, and our representatives got us involved in this, our state government passed a bill last summer, Senate Bill 82, that requires training for mental health in Ohio. And when you think about it, we were able to talk to our member schools. Let's get on the forefront of this. Let's help write the language and then incorporate it. Because in Ohio right now, it's required that you have concussion training, first aid training, the CPR, the coach, the initial course to become a coach. And a lot of times that 70% of people, when you tell them, hey, you want to coach 8th grade track? Oh, absolutely. And then you tell them all the training they have to do. Sometimes they say, I'm not doing all that. And so we're able to incorporate our mental wellness training into our trainings that already exist. And we're working on the frequency of these trainings. It really should be every year. And so we've been very fortunate in Ohio to have lawmakers who understood the need for that training, but also allowed us to shape it and allowed us to incorporate it in already existing trainings, because again, that was one of the reasons when you found somebody to coach track, and I'm guilty of this. I think Hannah mentioned 2010. You can tell by the color of my hair, I probably coached way before 2010. And sometimes I think about this. All of my PD as a coach was focused on X's and O's, not one bit of wellness for the athletes. And I wish I could go back and be that young 22-year-old again that was in a classroom and coaching and focused a little bit more on that wellness of my athletes and that. And I know I always like to share this little story. I know I'll be quick, Vince.
Do it.
But I saw this about 2 years ago. I have grandchildren playing sports and playing volleyball, and I was out of school on a Saturday, and it was a tri-match for 8th grade, tri-match for 7th. So there's 6 teams there, and 2 different gyms. And in Ohio, it was a beautiful fall day, and in between games, we all went outside. And there was about 60 adults out there and all the players and that. Well, before long, the 6 police officers had a guy on the front of his cruiser right out in front there and cuffed him, put him in the cruiser. I watched a little girl run by bawling, and somebody said, that's her father. And can you imagine being 13 years old and having your father get cuffed in front of your peers, in front of their parents, and running in the building? And it hit me. That a 22, I raise my hand and admit guilt to this, a 22-year-old Doug Ute would look at my assistant coach and say, how are we supposed to win with that going on? And that's secondary. But my mind went to, I wonder if that little girl, because I saw this little girl coaching, young little girl coaching that team, I wonder if she's equipped to deal with this and how they would handle this situation. And that's a lot of things that we have to talk about in the training of that, because our coaches in Ohio, the response we're getting back from our coaches right now about our training is, I now understand that when my team is healthy, mentally healthy, that those wins will come. I've got to take care of that first.
Before we segue into sort of some of our broader conversations, I want to ask you a question that I didn't have planned, but I think is in line with where we're at. This is a very pragmatic, quick question. What is one coaching behavior that you would, really sort of support or promote that coaches do that would help young people as it relates to their mental health, right? What is one sort of specific piece, and it could be part of your training or it could be something you believe. And I'll give you an example. Joe Mazzulla, who's the head coach of the Boston Celtics, I just heard about this, I think maybe last month, tries to spend 1 minute with every player on the team at every training. Even just 1 minute, just checking in. How are you doing? Where are you at today? Like, it's a little extra thing, but it can go a long way. What would you say? And open to the floor. Who wants to take that first?
Just keep it systematic here. The use of routines is huge for young people. It reduces wondering and anxiety in general, and it's so great not only for like mental health and emotional safety, but also for skill development. And so there's a ton of ways to incorporate routines in a way that is not boring, but is fresh and exciting and gives athletes choice and voice in what they're doing and allows you to check in. So I think that's one thing that I would push for sure.
I like that.
Yeah, for me, it's helping athletes focus on and sort of understand their own regulation, and sort of when they feel themselves getting overly worked up, when they feel like things are starting to get out of control, and how to reset themselves in those circumstances. I think normalizing that everybody gets dysregulated is really important, and you get dysregulated by different things on different days and in different circumstances. And part of what sport is really good at is helping us get the right doses of stress to become resilient to that dysregulation. And so if we're coming off of a bad school day, if we're coming off something that happened in the community, and we arrive in the sport space, first, we have to understand that kids cannot leave it at the door. That is not a thing. You cannot turn your brain off and say, all of a sudden, I'm just fine for basketball practice, to jump in the pool, unless we teach them skills that help them regulate those emotions, help them transition from sort of where they're at to the environment that they need to be in. Sport is also really beautiful at helping us get regulated, and if we can really amplify the use of these sort of positive skill-building, movement-based interventions, it's so much more about young people taking control over that versus adults spending their entire practice worried about compliance and who's behaving the way they're supposed to behave, as opposed to young people saying, oh, I'm feeling a little bit dysregulated. I'm gonna go, take my lacrosse stick and throw the ball against the wall for a little bit, use that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity to reset my brain, and then come back to practice before I blow my top.
Yeah, love that. Doug?
I think, Megan, you hit on a real good point. Kids can't leave it at the door. And you think about my common theme of lay coaches, and I'm a freshman basketball coach, so I get 7 o'clock practice. I'm not at the school all day. I have no idea what went on. And, I know this. I would tell you about this in my coaching days. I could tell my kids' attitudes every day when we walked in. But over time, I've really think about this, and I think what a coach can do, because it's very impactful when you put new teachers on. You put 40 new teachers on a couple school buses and drive out through your school district and your neighborhoods and show them that porch that's fallen in, and where your kids come from. And I think about coaches this way. Do you know your student athletes beyond what their skill level is at dribbling or shooting a basketball, in terms of who do they live with? What's the history of why they ended up there? Because you know this, and I'm sure Ohio's not alone in this. We have more grandparents raising their kids than ever before. We have more. A basketball coach told me a few years ago, Doug, I always have kids that come from single parent homes, but I got two athletes on my team this year that don't have a home, and they're just staying with another. So how well do you know your athletes and their background? And because I firmly believe this, you can't just help the student or a student athlete. You have to help that student or student athlete and their families to really make an impact in their life.
Wait, Vince, can I just modify
Yeah,
what I was going to say? So I take it back. Don't help kids with regulation. No, you should do that. But you can't do that unless you build the skill for yourself, right? A dysregulated adult can't regulate a dysregulated child. And so first, build those skills for yourselves, and then help young people build them for them.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think 3 you start to sort of connect these dots around an investment in kids, understanding of self, developing consistent interventions, whether they part of your everyday practice. It's also a nice segue because I think, the people in the audience will be like, okay, Vin's great, like sport's amazing, coaches should be trained, they should be doing these things. But if I'm an administrator or I'm someone sort of starting to think about like, what do we do? What do we do? What can we do? What needs to change in order to sort of advance certainly sort of youth sports as a space that enables, supports, certainly the coaches in particular to do this kind of work, because it doesn't happen naturally. And I remember being, 22 years old and starting my coaching journey, and, I sucked at a lot of stuff. I was not very good at some things. I was good at some other things. And so I guess it's sort of an open question to the group, and start where you want to start with it. But, is it about policy? Can we policy our way into more coaches trained? Is this about culture and the need for cultures that are more supportive of coaches? Is it about funding and investment and investing more into the supports and material resources that coaches need? Is it about coach pay? There's a lot of directions that we can go. Who wants to get us started on something that you feel is sort of an important part of this sort of system conversation about how to improve sport and coaching?
I'll start off with this one.
All right, Joe. All right, Doug.
Yep. There's no question in my mind. I've seen this year in and year out. We would always say, and maybe you do the same thing at your school. Our culture and our feel on how the school year gets started is usually by your athletic teams, and is your football team 4-0 or those type of things. But more importantly is what kind of culture do you create at your events at night because your community does not get to see your teachers teach math and English and science. Your community gets to see, they come in at sporting events. And so that's where I think if you create a culture and how do you treat people and how your student athletes behave, how's your community behave? We were sharing something last night that we have an initiative on our behavior at our sporting events in Ohio right now. And our schools are really locked into this where they're sharing ideas of positive things. And one that I really like and use an example is, if you go to a sporting event and that announcer starts announcing, you play the national anthem and they announce this, and this, and I look around and nobody's listening. Throw the microphone to a student, and it doesn't have to be a student athlete. Bring them out of the student section and let that student read a statement about expected behavior and those type of things at sporting events. It gets dead silent. And coming from the students, it's their game. And here's their expectations that way. And so I really think that sport can really help your culture, not just from 7:30 to 3 in your building, but can help your culture and how your community sees your schools and how your community supports your schools. And so how are the behavior of the students? How are the behavior of your coaches? How are the behavior of, this is one that really gets me. I get emails sometimes, and I just shake my head at this, at ADs who are yelling at officials, standing underneath the basket. And, those kind of things, that's a culture that your community sees and that expectation there. And so, nothing gets behind. We're right in the middle of the tail end of our tournaments in Ohio, where we have wrestling this weekend, state girls and state boys the 2 following weekends. And the communities that support those teams through that, they're more apt to support your math and science programs and everything else you do if that culture has created a positive culture that puts your student athletes in front of that.
Others?
Yeah, I think there's a piece of this is the narrative shift around mental health in general and how mental health care is focused on intervention only and almost only intervention in crisis, and that we're not as focused on prevention, obviously, and we're not focused on interventions beyond just sort of traditional clinical interventions. So I think thinking about how do we sort of democratize mental health care to more adults, to more contexts, to more culturally responsive practices, so that we're actually proactively promoting positive mental health. And my opinion about if we were able to sort of shift that narrative is that sport and coaches should absolutely be at the center of it, because the sport environment is uniquely suited to help young people heal from overwhelming stress or trauma. And there are too many young people who are experiencing overwhelming stress and trauma. And even if you aren't, these practices, the idea of focusing on safe environments where young people can show up as themselves, focusing on the value of physical activity and moving your body, focusing on the experience of being able to sort of be stressed and come back to a baseline, sort of manageable challenges that happen in sport. Those are the things that make us mentally well. And so it is both a healing opportunity and an opportunity to promote thriving that is different than 50 minutes of, therapeutic intervention, knowing that we don't have enough therapists to do 50 minutes of therapeutic intervention with young people. And so much of what's affecting young people is sort of somatic and embodied, and needs a somatic and embodied intervention.
Hannah?
Yeah, I think, excuse me, coaching as a whole is like a really under-professionalized, excuse me. Coaching as a whole, that's better, okay, sound less like Kermit. Coaching as a whole is a lot less professionalized, like as a whole in general. And so what we're expecting of coaches just kind of has to change, and an investment as just an investment into the space in general. I think there's an expectation that we have for teachers, and there's an expectation that we have for caregivers and recreation leaders that just isn't there for coaches. And so if we can think about both investment and then connection to policy change, and because the question right now is like, who holds the hammer? Right? There's no government oversight. There's often like not regional oversight that pushes us to do this. And so we're a culture of volunteerism often in youth sport. And so there's this really healthy tension of we're asking people who are either volunteering or really undercompensated to then also engage in this whole line of preparation in order to work with young people. And that's a really tough it's a really tough tension. I'm a parent of 2 kiddos, and I coach a lot of their teams, and I'm one of the first ones to roll my eyes when they ask me to go do another coach training. But it's needed, right? If we want to prepare folks for that. So I think there's some consideration both of how to professionalize the field. I think also as we dial in specifically around mental health and we think about mental health, there has to be just a shift on how we think about what appropriate sport environments look like. Like, just try to imagine another setting where we can put a grown adult in front of a young person and let them scream in their face, and it's fine for the outcome, right? So that they can win a game or they can move forward. Like, we don't let that happen anywhere else. But that has been the norm in sports for a really long time, is tolerating toxic behavior, abusive behaviors. And there are those really strong examples, but then there's also a ton of gray area in sport. And it starts at a very, very young age. You learn to tolerate, and that's how you get to the next level, right? Is to tolerate these negative behaviors. And that's the messages that we're told, is to, as Megan mentioned earlier, like, shut up and play. And I think there has to be a really significant shift in what we're doing. And I think there's an opportunity here, particularly for leaders, caregivers, parents, of trying to provide them, like, what should you be looking for in coaching and a youth sports program. And a lot of folks don't know that because it's an apprentice model of like we coach as we were coached, as was mentioned before, and like doing unto others what was done unto us. So I think there's a lot of systemic pieces and then some really tangible pieces around investment and policy that could help us move the needle.
And I think I love and agree with everything that's being said here. I think it's also probably worth highlighting that the approach and model, or sort of lack of a model that we have in the US, is not the norm internationally. There are countries around the world who do have systemic institutionalized investment in coaching, both as a profession, but also even among support for volunteers. I lived in New Zealand for 8 years, and the club that I worked at, we had a university literally down the street that had a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD program in coaching. You could get a degree in sports coaching, and you can get a meaningful job in youth sports with a degree in sports coaching, either as a community advisor or as a coach development officer. What prevents us from doing that and being in that space? It's a lack of coordinated, oversight and structures, state, local, and I would argue federal level. And I would encourage folks to read the Commission's report, which just came out, Passing the Torch, which looks at some of the systemic flaws in our youth sports system. But I'll come back to you, Doug, on this last bit before we open for questions, which is I also think about the decline of teacher coaches. And I think about the decline of teachers who are extremely well positioned to be sports coaches and have historically been sports coaches in schools. They have degrees that are founded on many of these areas, whether it be instruction, but particularly child development and related competencies. Why don't we have more teacher coaches? What's happened to the teacher coach?
Yeah, I think about this a lot. When I was in high school, football, basketball, baseball player, my head coaches taught me, the assistants taught me. They were in the lunchroom interacting with the players all day long. And, that shift really changed. I have a lot of reasons why. I know as an administrator, I know the pressure I would get from parents on some of these coaches, and it just wasn't at the varsity level. It was at the 7th grade level, for crying out loud, that parents just start diving in to coaches for winning and losing, those type of things. But I really believe in Ohio, the number one thing that changed that was state testing. And your evaluation in your classroom was impacted by your testing results. And then the influx of behaviors that started appearing in our classrooms that really put a lot of demand on a teacher that said, now I can't coach 7th grade basketball anymore because my test scores determine whether I have my job or not. And so, that really had a lot of impact on that teacher who wanted to coach and just say, and we're not just talking about the varsity sports, we're talking about 7th grade or 8th grade. Is just because of the pressure that comes through. All of a sudden, I'm a really good teacher, and I've seen it happen. All of a sudden, I'm a really good teacher, but the board president's neighbor's son didn't get a play. And so that pressure now comes from the board president to me back into the teachers. Now, I'm a former coach, so I was able as a superintendent just to back that board president off and say, hey, your job's to hire a superintendent and a treasurer. I'll take care of the rest and go from there. But a lot of administrators feel that pressure that comes with that, and I think it's that community and parent pressure that's hurt.
I think we'll pause there and invite the audience to ask any questions. We'd love to hear your thoughts and what's piqued your curiosity. I think you need to walk up to the mic.
Javier Wallace, currently researcher scholar, sport at Duke University. I have a question about, you can't see me. I have a question about the mental health and the growth of, let me pull up my question, I wrote it down. The influx of newer sport academies and the shifting landscape at the interscholastic level with all the basketball academies that are popping up. And they don't have the typical governance structure of like a state athletic association like Ohio. And some of these coaches are spending a lot of time with these athletes because they don't have like this 20-hour rule a week. Sometimes students are staying with coaches or staying in very close proximity to coaches, and coaches are to win, and there's not often a break that kids get from coaches. And I've seen it turn out negative. So I'm wondering, what do you all suggest we could do to address this new landscape in interscholastic sport with the amount of time that coaches are spending with students, and as their mental health is concerned, if they even have chances to break from the coaches that they spend so much time with? Thank you.
Who wants to jump in? Yeah.
Yeah, when we say do no harm, we're talking about that, right? So I think this is the problem with the sports system being so diffuse, right? There's nobody up here saying this, both Ohio and Washington are talking about school-based coaches. There are a lot of coaches who are not school-based, right? And even in these two cases, it's still hard to mandate something for those coaches where there's a clear, sort of accountability structure, hypothetical accountability structure. And these are two states of 50 and two states that are sort of on the forefront of this. We're already not doing a good job when there are accountability structures, and when there aren't, it's just the Wild West, right? And so from my perspective, we are setting sport up to fail, and by, first of all, not, sort of capitalizing on what it could and should be, and really exploiting it for what in many cases is financial, for financial reasons, and or coaches who are sort of looking for some glory that they didn't have previously in their experience.
I would add, I think there's an interesting identity piece to this. And one of the hats that I wear is teaching at the University of Washington, and I work with a lot of Division I student athletes who have been told from really young ages that their only value in our world is their athlete identity. And so I think that some care can go into, if you're looking for like a tangible strategy, I think helping these young people see who they are and valuing themselves, and some holistic care and wellness around their identity outside of their sport, particularly if they're at an academy, that's their job, in a lot of ways, is to be that athlete. And so I think that there's an identity piece of that, of trying to show some holistic care and helping them see the different avenues. And it's like, okay, the goal is to go to the league, great. Right? And how do we take care of you, and connecting that message of like performance and holistic wellness and identity.
And I think too, NIL starting to become a part of that for us as Challenge in Ohio, because we lost a really good athlete this year, a basketball player that went to another state and academy that allows NIL deals. We do not in Ohio. Our amateurism laws are well, a little ahead of the game, because we had a guy, maybe you've heard of him, LeBron James. We had a guy named LeBron James play in Ohio 23 years ago out of Akron, Ohio, that a lot of our things were put in for LeBron. But back there, I can't let that little logo go. I'll have to tell you OH as you sit down, man.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Alan Henderson. I was just curious, what advice would you give coaches about balancing parent expectations versus and what's best for the overall athlete, student athlete?
I can share one thing that we use in, I think parent education is huge. I think it's a frontier that's been untapped, because parents, I say this as a parent, I think parents get villainized often of the big bad influence that's coming in. At the end of the day, like, we usually all want the same thing for our kids, right? We want them to have a positive experience, get better at their sport, gain some of the skills, et cetera. And one of the things that we talk about is this, caregiver to coach bridge with the athlete in the middle, and understanding that there's some things that the coaches are responsible for, and conversations can happen when well-being is compromised, physical and emotional well-being is compromised on either side, and that's a great time for dialogue to be happening. Should parents be having say around X's and O's, you know, the offense that you're using, et cetera? Like, absolutely not. Like, that's the coach's lane. And so as you think about this bridge with the student in the middle and doing that, I think just setting a very baseline, and this has worked really well in my coaching, of if there's anything that you think is compromising the wellness of your athlete, let's absolutely talk about that, like wellness around your athlete. Otherwise, I'm pretty competent and I got it, right? I got it around here. So I think it's a really simple one, but it's been really effective, particularly at both like high school and like recreational levels.
I would just add to that, you know, don't be afraid to communicate with your parents. And obviously in Ohio, you're required to have a preseason parent meeting. I have 4 children, went to those, kind of like over here, roll my eyes. I was the superintendent at the school that had to go to these meetings, and you know, every time. But really, it's that communication. And I sit here and think, I know it's on a small scale, but I coach a church league 1st and 2nd grade basketball team, and I just love it. And I'm over communicating with those parents and grandparents every Wednesday night that we have practice. And not tonight, I won't be, because they'll be practicing, and every Saturday morning, just establishing, you know, I know it's a different level, and you said X's and O's, but for my 1st and 2nd grade team, I control it enough that everybody gets to bring the ball down the court. And I've got a couple kids that can really scoot and play, and it frustrates them. But I want their parents and grandparents to know, hey, this is what everybody's going to bring the ball down the court, and we're going to pass it, and everybody's going to get a chance to shoot and score. And your child could go down and score every single time. I know that, and I've mentioned that to a few of them. But this is about getting everybody involved at this, you know, at this level that way. And then the important thing is who has snacks Saturday morning, because the kids really like that.
We just got the sort of less than 5-minute warning, so. I'd like to sort of end on some calls to action from each of you. What's your sort of one thing that you'd like to leave the audience with about how we can either improve youth sports in this direction, improve coaching? What's one thing you want the audience to take home?
As I mentioned before, I wish I'd go back to being that 22-year-old that started coaching, but I certainly, as a school administrator, you know, would tell people, I tell coaches all the time, I don't care how many games you win, the community does. I want you to give our student athletes a chance to get better, and I want you to take care of them. And I want you to get to know them and take care of them. And I want a coaching shirt. I had all kind of coaching shirts back then. But really, as a superintendent, am I having those discussions with our principal and our AD and our coaches, just sitting around talking about the well-being of our student athletes and really spending time on that? Because I don't think, and I admit, I didn't do that enough. I certainly would now if I went back in as school superintendent. I'm not going to do that, by the way, but I would certainly spend a lot of time with our coaches and our athletic director and our principal talking about our culture and the well-being of our student athletes.
I think mine is related to what Doug said. I think I've been thinking a lot about the sports system and sort of what needs to go back into it. And to me, it comes down to we're all responsible for sort of putting love back into what shouldn't be a loveless system, right? I think most people will agree that sort of at the core value of sport is the opportunity to be in it with people that you care about, that care about you, that and that's different than you get from other experiences with other people. And so for me, it's like, if you're a parent, are you looking for it? Are you making sure that your kid's having a experience where love shows up? If you're a coach, how are you infusing it? If you're an athlete, how are you demanding it?
I love that. Joy is one of my coaching core values. So I think a lot about like how you bring joy into experiences. one thing that I've been thinking a lot about, which I suppose is a call to action, is the in-coach training, because we're trying to sort out the system of all of this. There's a lot of one and done, right? Like you take the training, never to be seen again in your career of coaching, down. So you take a 45-minute or an hour-long training and that's it. And so either challenging yourself, if you are a coach, of like, what is the feedback loop for yourself? If you take one gem from a training or like one big takeaway, how in your coaching are you going to continue to come back to that and say, like, this season I'm really working on incorporating more student voice and giving athletes more choice and autonomy. Great. So how are you going to check in and like create that feedback loop? If you're in the room and you're in charge, thinking about like what are the systems for that feedback loop and like check-ins. If you're asking your coaches to go through training, awesome, outstanding, keep it up. And how do you continue to have like check in about the content that was covered, and how they're receiving that and utilizing that, even if it's a small piece of it. So I think it's again like a larger picture, as we're thinking about the fabric, but I think that like those touch points that people get back to the content is really important.
Yeah, and I'll wrap up. This has been an important conversation that I hope folks can continue, and that would be sort of mine. Let's keep having this conversation. I think this conversation doesn't happen enough where we talk about coaching in a sort of more macro way. Where are our coaches? How are they doing? How can we keep getting better? What is our coaching culture? What do we know about where our coaches are at? And if you haven't already, millioncoaches.org. I also would recommend checking out the National Standards for Sports Coaches by Shape America and the Quality Coaching Framework by the USOPC. There are resources out there. You should also check out a few of these folks. They've got some amazing resources on offer, and I know there's a lot of training available out there for you. So thanks a lot for joining today. I know you have choice over where you spend your time. We hope you enjoyed it and enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.